Hello, my friends. I have a question for you. If your story is broken, but you don't know it, would you rather find out after writing 100 pages of a screenplay or after writing only 3 or 4 pages? My guess is if you're not into wasting time and energy like me, you would rather opt for the 3 or 4 pages option. And doing this is what is commonly called writing a treatment. Now, there are different names for treatments, there's different uses, and some things you should and shouldn't do when writing one to ensure you're getting the maximum benefit from using this tool. So let's start with ways that treatments are used, and then we're going to get into how to do them. There are basically 3 ways that treatments get used, and the first is just for personal use. Now, I know, you want to get to scripting. I totally get it because I love writing scenes too, but we need to back up a second. You've come up with a premise. You've got a log line that has some merit. You've mentioned it to a couple people. They think you're in good shape. They're interested. They wouldn't mind reading the story. And then you've spent some time outlining your story, and you think you've got the story beats all figured out. What characters you need for the story, and even some subplots along the way. And you think you're ready to start writing, but not so fast there, Skippy. The trap with outlines is they can make you think you have a whole story, but the problem is you are generally looking at outlines in pieces, in parts, and not really looking at the whole story. And that's where treatments come in. And treatments are there to make sure that you actually have a complete story from beginning to end. They force you to tell the story from beginning to end, and you will quickly find out if your story is broken or not. Because on paper or note cards or whatever it is you're using for your outlining process, it may look like you have a story. It may tick all the boxes. But until you try to tell that whole story from beginning to end, you honestly don't know if you have a story or not. And the other benefit of writing a treatment, besides finding out if your story is broken or not, is it helps you begin to figure out how you want to tell your story, or better, how your story wants to tell itself. Just in the act of writing a treatment, you begin to quickly figure out how to tell your story. But okay, Jake, what exactly is a treatment? All right, so let's just deal with that here really quickly. Simply, a treatment is a telling of your entire story from beginning to end, typically in the style of a summary of a story. So think like a Wikipedia summary. So if you look up a movie that you're familiar with, what is the story summary? That's kind of a treatment. You're at least close. Now, yes, it needs to be more engaging than a Wikipedia entry, but it's kind of that. It's kind of those pieces. And the telling of the story from beginning to end is what you need to have a treatment. What happens, and then this happens, and so on and so on. And when you do it, like when you're actually writing a treatment, you want to be focusing on words like but then instead of and then. Because and then is boring. But then automatically builds in twists and turns and reversals and much more interesting elements. So if you start writing a treatment and it's a lot of and thens, well, you probably don't have a good story because it's this happens and then this happens and then this happens and then this happens. That's just boring. We don't want that. If you've never written a treatment before, one solid way to do it is to alternate how you start your sentences. I mean, just a very basic, start your sentences the same way. We're practicing here. We're trying to figure out how to do it. So just start by doing it. And what you do is you start with your premise, and one and then is fine. And then do a but then. So each sentence you're going to alternate. And then, but then. And then, but then. And use that pattern all the way through. That will get you started and help you begin to stitch your story together. And you can use that to get all the way to the end, and you will have a rough treatment. Now, you'll obviously want to go back and fix some things, but you will at least have a good starting place. And this is why treatments are so helpful, because trying to write your story in a shortened form helps you quickly find out where you'll have some problems. I mean, you may find that your main character is just getting pulled along in the story, or they're a continuous victim of circumstance and that they actually aren't choosing anything, which is a problem. You may find that your characters seem too flat, or that your antagonist is honestly just kind of too dumb and easily defeated, or that they aren't active enough. You may find you're spending more time with supporting characters than with your main character. You may even realize that you need to tell your story out of order, because telling it in order is just telegraphing it too much. It makes it too predictable. And what it really comes down to is this. If you can't tell a compelling story in 1, 3, or 5 pages, How are you going to tell that same story in a compelling way in 115 pages? Newsflash, you aren't. Well, but you think, dialogue's gonna help. No, it won't. It'll actually make it worse. Dialogue is supposed to enhance the story, not hold it together. And this is why in my Screenplay Navigator, every student writes treatments before scripting. If you don't have a story in 5 pages, you ain't gonna have one in 105. So treatments can save you all kinds of headaches, because if you fix your story problems in the treatment stage, your screenplay is going to be light years ahead. Another reason you would write a treatment is to sell a story, to sell a script. Writing a treatment for the purpose of using it as a sales piece, though, is kind of a whole animal unto itself. And ultimately, you won't really do this until you're established enough as a writer that you are having general and pitch meetings with producers and executives who are interested in you as a writer or in something that you've written. If you're writing a treatment for a film that you want to sell, it is typically a 1-page treatment, and you're doing it to convince someone to buy your idea. You want them to read the script, and typically this gets asked for in 2 instances. Either after you've pitched a movie, they ask you if you have a leave behind, which is a 1-page treatment, or you've queried someone about your idea and they ask you for a treatment instead of the entire script. Now, I'm not getting into the merits of these practices, but the main point is that producers are busy people and they have to read a lot of scripts. And if they can read something that's 1 page instead of something that's 110, they'd rather read the 1 page. In this case, your 1-page treatment has to be so good that they can't help but react with a, well, now I have to read the script. I mean, that's the goal of these treatments that you're using as a sales piece, to get people to read your script. If they read your treatment and don't want to read the script, your sales piece just probably isn't good enough. Or maybe your story isn't good enough. But if it is good enough and they find some value in the 1 page, not only will they request your script, they might also hit like and subscribe. Maybe they'll even comment below about what they're finding helpful, or if they have specific questions about screenwriting and they can ask them there. Or maybe they'll share this video or another one they like on this channel with their friends, like you hope they would do with the script that you've sent them. They're sharing it with other people. Or maybe, just maybe, they'd like to further support the creator by becoming a patron for as little as a few bucks a month, and they can get some swag along the way depending on their tier, and have access to all of my archive videos and a few other things. And seriously, for those of you doing all those things, I really do appreciate it. Thank you for doing that. It really does help me out. And yes, if they like your treatment, they're gonna ask for the script. And if they like your script and they buy it, well, then you might have to write another kind of treatment for the studio, which is the 3rd kind of treatment, studio approval. Now, once your script is purchased, there will be notes, lots and lots of notes. The director, the producers, maybe even the actors, they're all gonna have notes. So you'll have to go back to the drawing board and figure things out. But before you start scripting, before you start revising your actual script, they're probably gonna wanna see a treatment that incorporates all of the notes. And if you're a new writer, they're definitely gonna wanna see a treatment. Really, they're looking for a few things. They're looking, do you listen? Are you able to incorporate notes we give? And they wanna know how you're gonna handle the story with the changes before you get to the actual scripting part. If you end up working in TV, some of you may want to work in TV. If you want to write in TV, this happens for every single episode. In TV, what happens is a group of writers in the writer's room, they break the story. Then the story is assigned to one specific writer. That writer goes away, writes a treatment, which can be upwards of about 20 pages. The showrunner approves it, and then it gets sent to the studio, who then gives notes. Now, those notes are then incorporated into the treatment, and the treatment is rewritten if the notes are major. But if the notes are minor, the writer then just goes away and scripts the episode, following the treatment and the notes that were given, which is basically most of the episode minus a dialogue anyway. That's really kind of what a treatment is at this point. I mean, treatments go back and forth in this stage until the studio approves it, and then scripting begins. So if you sell a script and the studio gives you notes, you might write a treatment, you send the treatment in. Once they approve the treatment, then you start scripting. And now we get into how you actually write a treatment, because it's a little different for each use. For studio approval, there are typically examples that you'll be given, templates, for you to follow. Different studios, different production companies, they have different ways of doing them, although the general elements are usually pretty consistent. If you're writing a treatment as a sales piece, because you have a pitch meeting and you might leave something behind, these tend to follow a rough formula, but they are definitely meant to communicate the story and the tone and style of what you're pitching. For personal use, no one else is seeing it. I mean, you're just using it as a tool to help you figure out your story and make sure you actually have a story. So in one sense, the format doesn't really matter, but I'd suggest practicing how to do it using the general guidelines you use if you were doing it for real. This gives you practice and makes you a little more comfortable when you do have to do it for real. Because at some point, hopefully, you're going to be doing it for real. So let's talk about some of the specifics for writing a treatment. And we're also going to note to which uses, personal, selling, or studio, these apply. When it comes to format, they're all pretty much the same. Single spaced on the page, typical 1-inch margins, and the title somewhere centered on the top. And this is all fairly standard. It should look like a treatment. All treatments kind of look like a treatment. Typically, you start with the title centered underneath is written by your name, okay? Then a space in between, and then you start writing the treatment. Now, the length is whatever is specified, either by you for personal use or by others. If it's a sell piece, it's usually only 1 page max, maybe 2, but rarely more than that. Typically, you want to keep it to 1 page. You want them to request your script, not read a 10-page treatment of your script. For selling, so it's usually 1 page. Sometimes you might hear this term that it's called a oneer. It's a 1-pager, a oneer. That kind of gets thrown around. You'll hear that occasionally. And additionally, regarding length, when it's for you, you want to limit yourself to 1, 3, or 5 pages, at least early on. This helps you not get lost in the weeds of your story. Now, if you find treatments helpful and you want to be even more detailed, well, yeah, you can write longer and longer ones. Some writers use treatments as really the first stages of their first draft. And once their treatment gets to about 40 pages or so, because they just keep expanding, figuring out the story, adding to it. Once it gets to about 40 pages or so, they begin transferring it into their screenwriting software and then just filling in the gaps. If it's for the studio, treatments can be anywhere from 5 to 20 pages. Again, whatever their template implies. So if they give you a couple of templates and they're all like 5 pages, don't give them a 10-page, give them a 5-page. And at minimum, on any of these, act breaks are typically new paragraphs. So a oneer, a 1-pager, will have at minimum 3 paragraphs. Paragraph for Act 1, paragraph for Act 2, paragraph for Act 3. For studios, sometimes each scene is a new paragraph. It depends. Again, follow their template. For you, it's just up to you. For me, if I'm working on a feature, I tend to put my sequences in different paragraphs. So I'll have 7 or 8 paragraphs, maybe 9, depending on the story. And I'll do that typically for me in 3 to 4 pages. I try to limit myself to 4 pages if I'm doing one just for me. Now, if I write a longer treatment, I'm breaking the paragraphs down scene by scene. Regarding typeface, for personal use and for studio use, treatments are typically in Courier typeface, font size 12. The same typeface used by your screenwriting software. Now, the studio may request a different typeface, but the one I've most often seen is Courier. And when it's for you, if you want to use a different typeface, that's fine. But Courier is a little wider, so you don't have as many words on the page. So if you start using Courier, you're going to have to, it helps you kind of learn a little bit more economy. So I'd recommend using it, but you don't have to if it's for personal use. For a sales piece though, you want to use something that is easy to read. So you may choose to play with different typefaces because they might evoke different emotions when reading them. So you do have a little more liberty for a sales piece, but don't go crazy, okay? So a good rule of thumb for any graphic design, no more than 3 typefaces, 3 font sizes. I mean, don't be like different typefaces and bold here and bigger size and italics over, like just calm down, slow your roll. Less is most often better. You want them focusing on your story, not on all your cool choice of typefaces and font sizes. Another thing that happens in treatments, depending on the treatment you're writing, is including story parts. Things like the inciting incident, or we end Act 1 on, things like that. So in noting key moments of the story, like I just mentioned, in a sales piece, you don't mention them. For a studio, you probably will, but follow whatever template you are given. When it's for you, well, absolutely mention them. It's for you. You want to make sure you aren't missing anything. You want to make sure everything is tracking when it should, and that you don't whimsically delete the inciting incident from your story. And this is a good place to mention that when you are doing this for you, the focus is on the story. When you are doing it to sell or for the studio, the focus is on the storytelling. And this is why treatments are so misunderstood. The use determines how it's executed. Now, if you're doing this for you, and once you know you have a complete story, that it's all working, if you want to redo a treatment and figure out how to tell that story, well, that's fine. It's for you anyway. You can, of course, modify it to make it work for you and help you figure out whatever it is you need. Another thing you do in treatments, and this is true across the board, is you always capitalize character names just like you would in a script. But the main difference, though, is that the character names get capitalized all throughout the treatment, not just on the first mention. So in a script, just their first mention, all caps. In a treatment, you capitalize their name all the way throughout. This helps someone who's just skimming through be able to track with what characters are involved a little more easily. Or if you're just trying to track with a subplot and just what one specific character is doing, you can kind of skim. It's a little easier to kind of jump through, and it helps you out. When it comes to subplots are a little more tricky. So when it's for you, well, it's up to you, okay, whether or not you want to include subplots in your treatment. I am going to circle back to that in a minute. If it's a sales piece, remember it's typically one page anyway. I mean, you want to communicate the main story. Subplots are rarely mentioned, in part because you just don't have the time. But if you do mention them, they're only hinted at and they're dispensed with in a sentence, maybe two. For the studio, because they're approving the entirety of the story, you're definitely noting the subplots all along the way. Again, you're telling the story for the studio. How are you going to tell the story? So all the subplots, all the little pieces, they all got to come out. Which also means that in all cases, you get to the very end. You always tell how the story ends. The hero saves the planet or they don't. The couple gets together or they don't. The college grad gets the job or they don't. Treatments tell the whole story. You're not hiding anything from anyone, and especially if it's for you, you got to get to the end. The style of how you write a treatment is kind of like a short story. I mean, you want to be telling a story. Maybe a better way to think about it is imagine you've just seen a story. Okay, you've just seen a movie and you are recounting that movie to your best friend. Write down what you would say to them. This is definitely true when you're doing it for yourself, although you kind of step out of the story a bit when you're doing it for yourself. You're noting all the act breaks. So as we reach the midpoint, Harry is emotionally and physically broken at the loss of his job and his family. That's for me. I would never write that sentence in a sales piece. Maybe write it for the studio. Because for the studio, yeah, you might be naming the story elements, but you're definitely going to be pointing out the emotions of things all along the way, because you're focused on the storytelling on top of the story. A sales piece, though, is a little tricky on this one because it's kind of like a short story and kind of not. It's more about the hype, the excitement, the gravity, the emotional heft of the story. For a sales piece, you want to give the reader a taste of what the ride is going to be like. It's going to have its ups, its downs, its gut-wrenching, rip your heart out, stomp on it moments, and it'll have this rainbow and unicorn paradise you can frolic in at the end. It'll be glorious. You want to read the script? Yeah, I thought you might. When it comes to dialogue, no treatments at any stage for anyone should be including dialogue. Maybe if your character has a catchphrase, okay, you get one line of dialogue, but treatments typically don't include dialogue. Perhaps in the studio one, maybe if the template they're giving you has some examples where they're using dialogue. But generally, you don't include dialogue. You're telling the story, you're talking about the story, what are the events happen, and then, but then, you get all the way to the end. One additional word on you writing treatments for you. Most writers I know do some form of treatment as part of their regular process of writing a script. It might just be 1 page, it might be 30 pages, Most I know are in the 4 to 10 page range. And if you're writing more than 2 or 3 pages, you typically do want to include subplots, things like supporting characters, and perhaps even some string characters. It's kind of that element of the longer you write, the more freedom you have with what you can include. But if you're trying to limit your treatment to 1 or 2 pages, you shouldn't be including a bunch of subplots and supporting characters. The antagonist, yeah, you're probably going to mention, but not really any other characters outside of the protagonist. So your protagonist, antagonist, that's about it. And it's fine to include subplots and other characters, but only if you're writing a longer treatment. And remember, if you can't write a complete story in 1 page or 5 or even 20, you won't have a complete story in 120. So before you start scripting, you may want to seriously consider writing a treatment to make sure that your story isn't broken. And again, I have all of my students in the Screenplay Navigator write a treatment before they start scripting. And if you're ready to transform yourself into a master storyteller who tells stories that matter, be sure to check out my Screenplay Navigator coaching program, which gives you lifetime access to several resources, twice a month calls, feedback on your work, and we work through writing a new screenplay every 4 months. Plus, you get access to the Screenwriting Fast Track course for a year. And if you're serious about becoming a better screenwriter, this is a path that will get you there. Ultimately, I just want to help you become a better writer and storyteller. And if you found any value and you haven't already, please be sure to like, subscribe, bell. I really do appreciate it. And when you go to tell a story, make sure it's working first in your treatment, and then be sure you tell a story that matters. See you later.